have a history and quite some time now, 8 years. I think I've known you all that time because we have something special in common happening again on the 6th of October, and holds a position of the Chief Executive Officer. He's a Fellow of the Leadership Victoria and a Fellow of the Australian Institute of Company Directors, and to get that you have to do qualification exams, etc. He was previously Chairman of the Destination Melbourne People and Parks Foundation, the Outdoor Education Group and Outdoors Victoria. He's currently Chairman for the Doodagalla Aid Services and sits on the board of the Royal Agricultural Society of Victoria and is a member of the Melbourne Chamber of Commerce Advisory Board. He's got a lot of hats. He's flown in for our meeting today and he's probably flying out tomorrow because it's his role all around the countryside. But we're very pleased, Scott, you've got the time to have a chat to us today. He's going to stay for a short time for lunch for those that want to catch up with him afterwards. But would you welcome the CEO of Royal Flying Doctor in Victoria, Scott Chapman.
Thank you, Roger, and I'll try and use a microphone, but if I'm not much chop at that, I'm just going to keep talking and yelling. But thank you very much for the invitation. Now, your last speaker was David Parkin, I believe. Yeah. David Parkin does a lot of work with the, I hope he talked about his mailbag or the prostate work that he does. He was my lecturer when I did a phys ed degree at Burwood Teachers College. And we've stayed mates for many, many years. I was doing a primary school teaching degree and he saw me, and I played a bit of footy, and he said, "What are you doing primary for? Why aren't you doing phys ed at high school teaching?" So he dragged me over, and I never taught. In the end, I finished the degree because I enjoyed the course, didn't want the career. My career was more in management, and hence I've always been attracted to working with groups where people come together for a common purpose, and you try and deliver what you have in common. And that's what I've always enjoyed. So I've been with the Flying Doctors for 8 years. Before that, I was the director of all the major events and marketing and programming at the City of Melbourne. 4 Lord Mayors was enough. I moved on after 10 years with them and decided I'd work for good instead of government. And the Flying Doctors picked me up. And little did I know that Victoria even had a Flying Doctor service. I thought I'd be working in the middle of nowhere. Well, I do a bit of that, but Victoria does have a Flying Doctor service. In fact, it all started in Victoria, in the Melbourne Town Hall, and I'll talk a bit about that as we go. Flying Doctor service is a $360 million a year service. We need to raise $360 million a year. We get $60 million of that from the Commonwealth Government each year, and that mainly goes to aircraft replacement. We get about $240 million from the various state governments. And as you know, state governments tend to only give money to state organisations. Hence, we're a federated model. Each state has their own Flying Doctors. In a way, we're 6 individual companies sharing a brand. And that's not unusual when you have a federated government in itself. We've gone through quite often looking at where we can find ways of saving money and effort by coming together as one national organisation. But the biggest threat to that is our state government funding. If you're a national body, state governments tend not to support that. That leaves about $60 million. A year, and that's our charitable side of this, where we would need to raise that $60 million a year. And on the 1st of July, I said to my marketing and fundraising team, well done for finishing the year strongly. Here's 20 cents, we start again. It's a big ask to keep raising that much money, but generous Australians, generous Victorians and other states, men and women around the country seem to like the Flying Doctor service because we are an iconic Aussie invention. Before I talk about that, I want to talk about the impact, or show you a bit about the impact of the Flying Doctors. So, Phil, are we right to play a short video?
every day I open my eyes and think, wow, I'm alive. Even if I've had a crap day, I still think, I'm alive. And you know what? I've got those flying doctors to thank for that. Hi, I'm Michelle. I live here at Neville, and these are my 3 children. This is
Emma, Josh, Olivia.
I'm a teacher at the local high school, but aside from that, I'm also a farmer. I can still see the top of that dirt. You'll have to bury it a bit more. If it wasn't for the flying doctor's service that came and helped me after my accident, I wouldn't have Emma here. She's my miracle child. When I had my accident, I was 13 weeks pregnant with Emma. And these 2 beautiful big kids here wouldn't have a mum. They saved my life. So I can't thank them enough. Got it all in. How's that go?
Good.
Good. Guys, do you want to go and make sure that that gate's shut for the sheep, please? Our grain farm was out at Quandialla, which is out near West Wyalong. We grew barley and wheat for both domestic and international market. The day of the accident, I wasn't even supposed to be anywhere near the grain loading area, but my uncle said, oh, can you just give me a hand with the grain auger? And he said, could you turn the machine off? So I went to turn it off, and that's when my ponytail got caught in the drive shaft and the accident occurred. I was completely scalped. I knew instantly what I had done. You know, you hear about these incidents all the time and you never think that it's ever going to happen to you or anyone that you know.
Michelle was taken to West Wyalong. The hospital then called the Royal Flying Doctor Service. In a pre-flight assessment, knowing that Michelle was pregnant and with such severe injuries, we would be needing to monitor very closely both her and her unborn baby. When
I was at the hospital at West Wyalong, obviously the doctors and nurses there had never seen anything like what had happened to me, and you could tell that they were really nervous, and that in turn made me a little bit nervous. The flying doctors walked through emergency and instantly the whole atmosphere changed. You know, said, right, these are the risks. You've got a high risk of infection, you know, you could possibly lose your pregnancy. They were honest with me and they said, what do you want us to do? And I just said to them, get me home. That's all I want. I want to be home. We don't have the facilities here that we need to get our medical attention. I don't think people realise that, you know, it's not just around the corner, it's not just down the road. There's lots of farming accidents that happen every single day. And if the flying doctors weren't there and I couldn't get to the specialist attention that I needed, my children wouldn't have a mum, you know, and I wouldn't be enjoying the greatest gift there is, life. How can you ever repay someone for your life? How can you? You can't. So, yeah. And now I'm getting emotional thinking about it. Thinking about how much I owe those guys, like. Yeah, like if they weren't there, I wouldn't be here, you know. And that's fact.
So Michelle is a local teacher, as she said, mother of 2, farmer and farmer's wife, pregnant 13 weeks, 500 kilometres from the nearest help. And we transported her from West Wyalong into a capital city. I get emotional watching it because that's what we do every day. And we've been doing it for 90 years. So this year is the 90th anniversary of the first flight. 17th of May, 1928, from Julia Creek, from Cloncurry to Julia Creek. We hired a plane from a new company called Qantas. Queensland and Northern Territory Aerial Service. Hudson Fish and his partner had launched this new airline about 8 months earlier. John Flynn was a great mate of his and said we'd like to see whether we can fly a doctor out to a small country area. So Cloncurry was where Qantas was born, and at $1 a mile, we hired the plane, flew a doctor out to Julia Creek, and from there we now have the Royal Flying Doctor Service. Back then, Australian Inland Mission, and then it became, we spun off a number of things. So, 9 decades of healthcare. Now, I just want to see if this works. Here we go. And you can see an early patient there just sitting behind the seats of a plane. That's right. You can see this plane here, which was the first one, the Victory, named after Victor Mackay. And Victor Mackay was the founder of the Sunshine Harvester Company, the biggest harvester company manufacturer in the world at the time. And he was a great supporter. And that story will come as I speak. We used to strap people on the wings, patients. So 9 decades of healthcare, and we're still needed every day. I spoke about the fact that we're a $360 million service with 6 states all providing flying doctor services. 14% of what we do is the swoop and scoop, as we call it. The aeromedical emergency retrieval work, such as Michelle. But it's only 14%. But that's our hero brand. That's what people know us for. The aeroplane, the Outback, help your mate, all that sort of stuff. 40% of what we do is inter-hospital transport, where we're actually just moving people from secondary to tertiary hospital, repatriating people back home, bringing people in for cancer treatments or diabetes treatments. So that inter-hospital and inter-home transport is about 40% of what we do, and the other 40%, leaving 6% aside for admin and fundraising, the other 40% are clinics, where we take healthcare professionals and doctors into communities and provide services. Last year in Victoria alone, there were 886,000 movements of a medical or health professional, a dentist, whatever, from one town to another, just to cover the population here, never alone the rest of Australia. So not all towns have what they need. Mental health workers, gynecologists, physios, dentists, all the rest of it. And that's a big issue that we've got, is workforce planning is difficult. People don't tend to want to live in regional, rural and remote areas. Everyone's moving to the towns. So getting doctors and others to live out there is a challenge. So the story I'm about to tell you actually appears in your wallet. Now, I'm not asking you for donations, I'm not asking you to take $20 out. But we're very fortunate that our story is in everyone's purse or wallet. But most people don't even know it's there. So John Flynn, our founder, is right in the middle. Here's the Victory aeroplane, named, and it was supposed to be called Victor, but it was called Victory. There was a typo, I think, after H.V. Mackay. Here we have a pedal radio, and we'll talk a bit about that, and a body map. And that body map was the first example of telehealth medicine, really. So we have around the country 2,800 medical chests. A medical chest is just a box with 8 shelves in it, and all the a chemist virtually in that chest. They're on oil platforms, in remote communities, on big stations, in small towns, on farms, and people used to, by Morse code or by radio, ham radio, now mainly by telephone, will call up us as an emergency. We'll assess the situation to see whether we send a nurse or a flight nurse or a doctor, or whether we even need to go. And in the meantime, we'll talk whoever's on the other end of the phone through self-medication using our medical chest. And on top of that medical chest, after you open the lid, is the body map, and that body map's numbered. So it's simple. It's medicine by numbers. Which bit hurts? Okay, well, it's hurting at number 7, so we know it's down here. Okay, in the number 7 grid. And then we'll just say, okay, go to shelf 6, and they're all numbered. Get out a number 12 and a number 13, and if they're gone, put a 25 on. Not really. And we'll do that, and in many cases we can administer over the phone. So this was John Flynn's invention before we had video and all the rest of it. Very clever. he was also responsible, as you know, for School of the Air, which was born out of this as well. So a great man, John Flynn, and a Victorian. So it was in Victoria that it all started, but why was that? John Flynn was a Victorian, born at Malibel, just outside of Bendigo. He decided to be a school teacher. His mother died virtually in childbirth. He moved to Sydney for a couple of years, then back to Snake Gully, and then he moved into that Sunshine Northcote area out that way. He went to Ormond College at Melbourne Uni to be a teacher, and then he felt the calling more to into the presbytery, so he ended up being employed by the Presbyterian Church. And he was ordained in Adelaide, but he was made the first superintendent of the Australian Air Mission at the Presbyterian Scots Church on the corner of Collins and Russell. Very good, very good. And we still each year have a service there. The Reverend Doug Richardson always conducts a Royal Flying Doctor service around about the time of John Flynn's birthday, which is in November. So John Flynn started all of this. So he was then sent out to Beltana in South Australia to work with the local communities and the bush nurses. And he soon realised that things weren't flash out in the bush. People in the city had no idea of the distances and the isolation. And this is back in 1910, 1911. So he would write letters back to his church saying, "I need more help out here." He'd write to politicians. He'd come back and give talks like this to people in various capital cities and try and raise money for his dream, which he called a mantle of safety across this great nation. But it was tough times back then. There was not a lot of population, but there was a lot of distance. And then in 1917, something happened that finally galvanised the rest of the country behind his dream. And if it's okay, I'll read a bit from a book here, which I like. It's called The Jimmy Darcy Story. Well, the book, of course, is Flynn of the Inland by Ian Idris. So, think back. We've now got John Flynn, who's been agitating for a long time for some solution. They had all been using camels in those days and jalopies. But it was a tragedy at Halls Creek which showed people of Western Australia, as perhaps nothing else would ever have done, the crying need for the materialisation for everything for which Flynn dreamed. Young Darcy was a mustering. Darcy was 17 years old, half-caste Aboriginal with a couple of his brothers. And they were out there in the Kimberleys mustering. His horse was a bit skittish and they were riding along, and rather than read the whole 17 pages because we'll be here till dinner time, I'll paraphrase. Crash. Darcy's horse thumped down and was completely somersaulting and threw the rider heavily. His mates found him and they harnessed a buggy and put him in that. Now the nearest man to where Jimmy Darcy went down had any medical knowledge was at the telegraph station in Halls Creek, 300 miles away. And it was the Postmaster General, Mr. Tuckett. It was a dreadful drive, right? No road, merely a bush track meandering over plain and along mountain valley, crossing hundreds of gullies and unbridged creeks. When the pain became unbearable, they'd lift Darcy out and put him on the ground where he rolled in desperation while his mates just silently watched. When the pain subsided, they'd put him back into the buggy and continue on. It took 4 days to get him there. Mr. Tuckett was at home when at last the buggy drove up. He examined Darcy gravely, recognising with a sinking heart that this was a case beyond his skill. In fact, Tuckett had done first aid back in Perth, so he'd done what most of us had probably done. Not a lot. He did have a little bit there, and he injected some morphine and then decided to get in touch with his old first aid teacher, who was now a doctor, Dr. Holland, back in Perth. How did they get in touch? That was it. They were 1,100 miles apart as the crow flies, 1,700 by a quickest cut, and 2,283 by the wire that connected the two Morse code machines. At last the doctor decided, Tuckett, you'll have to operate. Operate? What? He said. How can I? But you must. I have no instruments. Darcy is laid out on the telegraph bench at this time. You have a penknife and a razor? Yes. I have no drugs. You have some permanganate of potash? Well, yes. You'll have to try. Kevin, I might kill the man, says Tuckett. Holland said, if you don't, he'll die anyway. This is all like that. Simple preparations were made. Darcy clenched his teeth as there was no anaesthetic. His calm helped the amateur surgeon who worked steadily, making no slip, only the sound of the tick, 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 tack, tick, tick of the Morse code machine sending instructions to Tuckett, who was interpreting the dots and dashes while he was undertaking this operation. There was an issue down here with Darcy. The operation proved successful, but Darcy had only recently recovered from fever. His constitution was further weakened by the dreadful 4-day drive. Complications set in, and 2 more operations under the same circumstances were done. Now, the interesting part of this is that the Argus, or whatever paper was in Western Australia, was also picking up off the wires this amazing story happening in the outback. It became evident that the man who so gamely battled was going to die unless he received specialist medical treatment. So Dr. Holland set out on his 1,700-mile race against time. He got a boat, a very fast boat, up to Wyndham. That took 5 days. After jumping off of the boat, there was a jalopy waiting for Dr. Holland and his party. They undertook that piece of that work, and they got for a day and a half until they got close to Fitzroy Crossing. But at that point, the big panting auto was beaten. Remember, there's no real roads out there. At Fitzroy Crossing, there was a little car manned by a Halls Creek man. So they jumped into that, and for 3 more days, they virtually either the car carried them or they carried the car, calling into stations to get fuel, tipping up the car on its side in order to make sure that enough fuel would get to the carburettor. There was dust, there was sand, there was everything else in it. There were flies, there were mosquitoes. 5 times the engine broke down completely, but they jumped off, they'd rush into repairs, sooner or later getting it going again. And then eventually, once the engine stopped for no apparent reason, the petrol was exhausted. So they got horses, and onto the horses they got. We're kind of getting close to 14, 15 days since Darcy fell off his horse, and this is our emergency response. Soon they adjusted. Anyway, so they're on horses, and for 5 days they rode horses. Okay, and eventually, 20 miles from Halls Creek, one of those horses died. Eventually, and Australia's now listening and reading this each day in the paper, and it's galvanised. Come on, Holland, get there, get there. 17 days after the accident, Dr. Holland walks into the post office. How's the patient, he said. So you can see that it's a real tough place out there in Australia. He died yesterday, said Tuckett. And the doctor said, time wins again. but it did what John Flynn had been trying to do for so long, and that was to get the country galvanised behind him. But of course, this is 1917. We're in the middle of war. It's not the highest priority of governments or people. It's a big place, Australia. A huge place. Eight million people of us, of our 25 million now, live in what's classified as rural and remote, which is more than 50 or 100 kilometres from the nearest help. Here's a few photos of the early days. From that, we are now Australia's third largest airline. Not in terms of turnover, obviously, but in terms of aircraft. We have 69 aircraft, 24 bases around the country. Here we have a base in Essendon and a part of a one in Sale. It's Launceston in Tasmania, Port Augusta, Alice Springs, Broken Hill, Charleville, on we go, Meekatharra, Darwin, each of the states. And clearly a lot more modern than what it was back then. We've got 4 PC jets ordered now, because we're now finding that the distance, although we can cover the distance, it might take 2 or 3 shifts of pilots, refuelling, stopping, starting, where with these jets we can go from Perth to Darwin and back again in a quarter of the time. They're each $11 million with a $2 million fit out. So the first one arrives in October, which means we have to retrain our pilots and look at where we can and can't take these jets. They can't land on 500 metres of a dirt strip. They can only really go between major regional centres. Here we have up there the pedal radio. So let's go back to 1917. Darcy's unfortunately dead. His grave is there. This year, in our 90th year, we spent a little bit of money doing it up because it hadn't been touched since 1917, 100 years ago. John Flynn has now cracked it. He's sick of the church not supporting him or government not supporting him, the whole lot. And this is 1917. He started this in 1910. So this has been 7 years of him trying to agitate. In 1917 also was another Victorian, Clifford Peel. He was an airman, and he was on his way to Belgium to fight in World War I. And he'd picked up the story of Jimmy Darcy and sent a letter to John Flynn saying, what about these new things called aeroplanes? And he drew a map and he worked out the cost, the distance that these aircraft could fly, and John Flynn received this letter, and Clifford Peel was actually on a boat on his way there. Clifford Peel was 24. He was shot down and killed 7 weeks before the end of the war in 1918. He never really saw the contribution that he actually made to what became the Flying Doctors. Another Victorian. The 100-year anniversary of his death is in September. It's being held down near Terrigal in the west of Victoria. His family are very proud of Clifford Peel. Not because of his war record, which was not long, but because of his contribution to this great Australian icon. So, John Flynn's a Victorian from Malayagal. We've got Clifford Peel. But there were 2 other things that John Flynn needed. The medical side he had through his friend called Dr. Simpson. He now had the idea of the transport, but he needed reliable communication. And the problem with this was that they were battery operated. So if your batteries went flat, your bank of batteries, it might take you a week to get into town and change them over and bring back the new batteries. And another Victorian, we claim him as Victorian, he lived on the border of Victoria and South Australia. His farm was straddled both. I reckon his house was on the Victorian side. was Alf Traeger. Alf Traeger was a German. His parents had come from Germany. He was a ham radio specialist and everything else. And it was the pedal radio, the generator with your feet, while you actually tapped out with your hands, that gave John Flynn the opportunity to have reliable communication, not reliant on batteries. And then the final part of the puzzle was another Victorian, as I mentioned before, H.V. Mackay. H.V. Mackay, Sunshine Harvester, great philanthropist, great man. He would provide his workers out in what became Sunshine, housing, churches, schools. He was a very generous man. And he died. When I get some water for your eye, Phil. Take mine out. I haven't had mine, so I'll run that out. So he died in 1927 and left £2,100 to John Flynn's, as he called it, aerial experiment. And it was with that money that John Flynn went to Hudson Fish and the first flight happened in 1928. So from 1910 to 1928, 18 years it's taken this man to get this, at least the experiment, off the ground. And then in 1934, the very first base, the first place was built in Wyndham. Why Wyndham? It's kind of the spiritual home of the Jimmy Darcy story. It's where Dr. Holland landed, up in the Kimberley. So, lots of great Victorians. In Melbourne Town Hall was the first meeting of the Flying Doctors, or Australian Land Mission, as I said. It's the Scots Church in Collins Street. And Victoria was the first of the states to get going. But we never delivered a service here. We always delivered our services into the Kimberley. So Victoria ran the Kimberley region for 70 years, while West Australian Flying Doctors looked after the bottom half, because there was not enough population to look after the great distance. From the pedal radio and the body map, we now do, last year, 88,000 people would dial in and we would provide medical advice and medical assistance over a telephone or over a video, which now connects these people. So we're not using the aeroplane, we're actually doing our primary health like that. Oh, it's very good to have some royalty come and visit every now and again. These are the clinics. So this is 16,000 clinics. 16 times we sent people into either remote areas for 3 days, and people drive 300 or 400 kilometres in to see the doctor or see the dentist. But here in Victoria, we do exactly the same. We have 2 dental surgeries, trucks with dental surgeries in the back of them, and we drive to places in Victoria where there's no public dentistry. Interestingly, public dentists are on strike today. That's an issue for the health department. So we drove into a town, Timboon. They booked us for 3 days. So in we go with our dentist and our dental surgery. We were there for 3 weeks. This is in November last year. Because over 50% of the children up to the age of grade 6 had not ever been to a dentist. We were there for weeks doing all the treatment, extractions, fillings, the whole lot. And all that is free. So public dentistry is a big issue. If you're in private health insurance, or you can afford the dentist, like probably most of us, we're fine. But if you can't, people aren't doing it. So this is inside of our mobile dental clinic. In Victoria, we also have 115 ambulances. So we do a lot of the non-emergency inter-hospital transport on behalf of Ambulance Victoria, so they can get on with the emergency work. Hence, we have 17 ambulance bases around the state, and in Tassie and in New South Wales, all run out of the Victorian office, and just on 500 families have a breadwinner. We've created 500 jobs for people. We do charge for this service, but not the patient. It's either through private health insurance TAC, or in fact it's paid for by the hospital who's either dispatching or sending the person. And you may see some of these where we say that we're transporting with care on the road and in the air. So last year 70,000 people were moved for care.
That's just in Victoria.
That's just Victoria. The other states haven't picked it up yet because innovation comes slowly. Just ask John Flynn. So when we started this in Victoria, the pilots and the doctor, hang on, we're flying doctors, we're not road doctors. I said, hang on, you used to be camel doctors before you had aeroplanes. So that the aeroplane is just a means of transport. What our job is, it's about responding to people in the best way we can, either by telehealth or by road or by air. 40% of the people we help in Queensland, West Australia and Northern Territory are Aboriginal. And interestingly, we're called up there sometimes the black man's taxi. That's an unfortunate label, but quite often we do have some frequent flyers who aren't exactly sick, but feign sickness. We go to pick them up, and we say, okay, we'll take you to Broken Hill, so we actually want to go to Dubbo. So no, we're going to Broken Hill, well, I'm feeling better now. So that happens. But you'll get abuse or advantage of any service in any way, so that's fine. So 142,000 Aboriginal Australians live out there, and there is a lot because they certainly are an underprivileged group. We don't see a lot of it down here, but if you're living in the outback or living in some of the bigger desert states, it becomes a real challenge for us. This is just a bit about, we have all of our flight nurses are also paediatricians. They can deliver babies, they can do all those sorts of things. But we are the lifeline for many families out there. The biggest issue is access. So in Victoria, we've just launched last week a community transport, which is not where you're in an ambulance, you don't have to lie down, but people who are isolated on farms or living alone who won't or can't access healthcare, we'll go and pick you up and drive you in. So we have a volunteer program. It's started in Heathcote, and already we're getting demands from the rest of the state and other parts of the country to say, we'd love this service here. And we run that through volunteers and donations. I don't want to go on too much longer. I don't know how long we've got this running for. But if you're living in the country, you're going to die sooner than you're going to if you live here. That's a fact. Suicide rates are higher. Cancer rates are higher. Mental health's an issue. Drug and alcohol and ice is a big issue in some of the country towns. And it's because there's just not the specialists out there that we can get access to by telephone to our doctor. In fact, to get a mental health plan, you have to be referred by a doctor to a psychiatrist. If there's no doctor, you can't get to the psychiatrist. So there's a lot of issues there. In terms of mental health, and I'll just slip through this. 9 out of every 1,000 people diagnosed with depression, on average suicide, in the city. 41 out of every 1,000 in the country. So that's 4 or 5 times the amount. So you look at what's the factor, and the factor is specialist mental health, psychology, psychiatrist workers. They just don't have access to them. So we have a mobile psychiatry service. There's also, and I'm sure no one here is in this category, the grey nomads. A growing population of men who think they're boys, who think they can still, well, if I can't wind up the caravan, I'll just lift it. Who don't drink water, because when I grew up, you didn't drink water. Water was for washing. Okay? So a lot of things have advanced. We are not, this population, we're not the greatest at looking after our health. Please do it. So we're finding that we're getting more and more calls from the emergency side for people who are travellers and visitors, not just people who live or work in the outback. And you may have seen, if you've gone across some of the places like the Nullarbor, across the air highway there, we land wherever we can land. So our small aircraft are either PC-12s or Beechcraft. They have to land and take off within 600 metres. So that's what is we can take 2 people, 2 patients, and maybe one family member. We only have one pilot in the front and one medico in the back, and that's for weight considerations, because we're getting more and more equipment being placed on our aircraft because of the demands and the types of emergencies we respond to. Sometimes we'll have to unload equipment. Sometimes we can't take the family members as well. It depends on the emergency, the distance, the weight. And of course, as we're all getting heavier as a population, bariatric issues are starting to arise. So in our ambulances, for example, we have 3 specialist ambulances that can take 500 kilo people. And we're finding that's happening more and more, especially in country areas. And we're often called to those where the person has really fallen out of bed and is wedged between the bed and the wall. So weight is becoming a big issue for our aircraft. So I've gone from 250s to 350 King Airs because of a little bit more equipment, but a lot heavier population. We are also a first responder when there's major disasters. We don't have helicopters. People often say, why don't you have helicopters? I think we should have helicopters. But the cost of operating an aircraft, a propeller aircraft, either the twin or the single, Pilatus is a single, is about 30% cheaper than the twin. I'll tell you why we have both in a minute. Is about $2,400 an hour by the time you include the fuel, depreciation, the cost of the staff, the engineering, all the rest of it. So we need to recover $2,400 each hour. The helicopters are around $5,000 to $6,000 an hour. They're not exactly aerodynamic, they're not designed to fly or glide. There's a lot more fuel used and there's a lot more downtime in terms of maintenance. We don't have helicopters because when we started, distance and speed was critical, and helicopters were neither fast or couldn't go very far. It's now changing. Whether we step into helicopters in the future, we'll have to see.
We're supposed to be the big bad tough bushy out here sort of thing, and everyone's human. It just grinds you down. The drought, you just we're 50 year, and it just seems relentless. You start to get your hopes up, thinking, oh, there's one rain forecast, and it doesn't turn up, and it's like the big down. Like you just get to a stage where you wonder whether you can get out of bed in the morning to deal with it. But to get out of bed and just go, oh, again, it's a bit like Groundhog Day. It just keeps going round and round. I've been moving cattle about if there's trying to move them to a little bit more feed and hope for the best that they'll pick up a bit more feed. You're trying to move poor stock or walk poor stock, it doesn't make you feel good when everything you work for is sort of on the downhill. Then they're not worth anything to sell. And we'll sell the whole place up. Well, who's going to come and buy it? You put all your time and money into this asset, and it's going downhill. It's going backwards. And the bank manager's, he wants cash flow. We'll see what's happening, what's going on. Are you going to make your payments, or not going to make your payments? So you end up borrowing more money against it, and put another brick in the wall, I suppose. You just got to try and keep going. Being able to unload to just be able to talk to someone, to take the weight off. I think there's something to be said for talking to a person, not a machine or a telephone or something, and feeling like someone cares, that it's not all for nothing. It's not all for a lost cause. There's someone that actually cares what's going on, and that you're not alone. You're not as isolated as you think you are. And the Flying Doctor, I mean, it's got everyone trusts the Flying Doctor. Like for years, it's always been there. That's what the Flying Doctor is, always there. It's that in times of need, the Flying Doctor. I don't see it any different with mental health. It's health, it's well-being, it's just getting access, and they've got the trust. Like you trust the brand, I suppose, or the organisation.
So Jeff moved off the family farm and bought his own 5 years ago. He's been in drought for 5 years. When people used to work on farms, there might be 30 blokes working on your farm. Now you can run your whole farm just by yourself. And people like Jeff sit in their truck or their grain harvester or whatever it is, going up and down the rows, moving cattle on their own all day with no one to talk to. Wondering about the weather, wondering about the bank, wondering about who's going to take over the farm when he gets older. And suicide rates are huge at the moment and is very relevant with our farming community. And because we're stoic blokes often, we don't seek help. So we're now spending perhaps more time in mental health for our farmers than we are almost in our retrievals. That's what the Flying Doctor does. We're not just out there in a plane picking up people in emergencies. That's 14% of what we do. It's all this other work that we do that tries to keep this nation together. Thank you very much. I hope you've learned a little bit about who we are and what we do.
We've got time for just a few questions, not statements, please. Questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Kevin.
It was very interesting and an insight I would appreciate. I've noticed situation of ambulances running around the suburbs and like. What's the rationale for that, since there is an established provider? Are you trying to duplicate, or is it money to be made out of it, or perceived need?
Okay, so Ambulance Victoria, in Victoria, Ambulance Victoria is the only organisation that's allowed to do emergency work. Okay, in other states we can do some by air, but on the ground it's usually the State Ambulance Authority. They get called to all sorts of things. So when you need to move a patient from one part of a hospital to another, which might be just over the road, they call it those people. And what they were finding is that a lot of non-emergency work, because they were the only carrier of stretchers, was getting in the way of the emergency responses. So they spoke to us and a couple of other companies that's now competitive and tenders, all the sort of things that we have to do. So we provide 40% of their non-emergency work in Melbourne and about 38% across the state. That's what it's about, allowing their response times to get better. Interestingly now, it comes down to the acuity and the sort of patient that you have. So if a kid breaks his leg at a footy match on a weekend, people would call an ambulance. Is it really an emergency when a non-emergency crew, which have paramedics as well, can do the same thing? So we're doing a lot of first responder stuff. It's not competition, it's complementary to allow them to get on with the real business of emergency.
John.
Yeah, John.
I'd be interested to know what's the turnover of staff in relation to the medical people particularly.
So the question is about turnover of staff. It is hard to get people, professional people who have done years of university, to live in country areas. It's as simple as that. because the schooling may not be the best for their kids, or the social, all those sorts of things. And it's very hard for a doctor to go out into a country town, hang up a shingle, take out a 3-year lease on a building, move the family up there, hope there's enough population to make his practice or her practice worthwhile, put in the BAS statements every quarter, all that sort of stuff. So what we're doing is we're employing lots of those people, and it is fly in, fly out, or drive in, drive out. For us, we don't have a high turnover of staff for a few reasons. One is they love working for the brand, and we're a cause. We are a high value, high values, good cause, not for profit. People are there for the right reasons. When we do get people who leave because they're living in isolated places, it is because of those times. You know, they might last 3 or 4 years, and then the kids are old enough where they have to make a decision on where do you want to bring up the children. Country areas are great for many reasons, but why is everyone moving to the cities? And that's where everyone's going.
One more question, Andy.
Oh, I would just like to ask about the funding. When I've learned a bit about the Royal Flying Doctor Service, I was told that only a small proportion is paid for by the Australian government. Was such an essential service. Was there ever a time when they fully funded it?
So it was John Howard. So the question was, the Commonwealth government, how much money do they give us, and did they ever fully fund us? They never fully funded us. In fact, it was only John Howard who actually gave us the first grant. Up until then, it was donations, and it was eventually the state government's putting some money in to provide that 24-hour retrieval service. In Victoria, no money comes from the Commonwealth government, and no money comes from the state government. We do it all by the road transport income, and also through donations. So we are always in there doing our best to get monies. You would have heard recently Toombul announced an $84 million grant for the Flying Doctors, which was nice spin and appreciated, but that was $84 million over 4 years. That makes $21 million. Of those $21 million, $10 million was what they took out of their budget 2 years ago. So they just restored it again. That leaves $11 million, of which $5 million was for mental health services to continue the funding we were already getting, because it stopped, the 4 years stopped, so that was a continuation. It's appreciated, but it's not new money. And $5 million was for dental services. But then you divide that by 6 states, and you're getting down to about $800,000 of new money. Good spin for the government, and it also means, and donors ring up and say, oh, you're getting all this money, it's great, you don't need ours. Well, hang on. So no, but we're you know, there's lots of competing needs, and we're in there doing our best to get what we can.
Thanks.
I'll go over here.
I just wanted to say, before I ask Peter to come forward to make a vote of thanks, I've known Scott for quite a long time, and I think he's been a brilliant speaker and giving us a good talk about what we have. I have a personal interest. I'm the patron of the Flying Doctor Rowathon. Over the last 24 years, we've raised over $500,000 for the Flying Doctor, particularly in recent years for the mental health and the dentistry area up in the Sunraysia area of Victoria. I have been donating for, I don't know how many years, something to the Flying Doctor. I find that it's getting very sentimental here. It's got
you're getting a bit teary.
I find it just something that's we can feel part of. And you heard about the funding, how much they need, $360 million, yet the government's not giving a lot, so it's us, Australians, who need to get behind it. And, thank you, Scott, and I now ask Peter Flood to come forward and make a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Roger, and I think you've covered it pretty well. And congratulations to Roger for the speakers we've had so far this year. What another great speaker today, and what a wonderful organisation. To think that we've got this organisation based in Victoria, which I think we all thought of the Flying Doctor as something from Northern Territory or Queensland. But the amount of work that you're doing in Victoria is great, Scott. It's a great job that you've got, getting around the countryside and trying to find $60 million a year from the public. It's not an easy task. Thank you for coming along, giving up your morning, talking about this iconic brand, which I think we put up there with Qantas and Vegemite. It's certainly well known to us all. It's much loved by us all, and when we get our $20 note out later today, I think we'll all have another look at it and have a look at the work of Flynn and others over this 90 years. Thanks, Scott, and something towards your $60 million fundraising.